Today in our 2018 Chevrolet Silverado 2500, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install the Firestone Air Command 2 compressor and air tank, part number F2168. And to help us with our installation, we're going to be using the Firestone No-Drill Mount Kit for the air tank and compressor, part number F2530. So here's what our compressor and gauge kit looks like once we have it installed inside of our truck. Now this is going to allow us to adjust our airbags without ever having to get out. Simply turn the key on, we can hear the compressor kick on, and then we'll be able to fill up each one of our airbags individually. Now the gauge will let us know what our airbags are set at, and since we're able to adjust them individually, it will really help out with those off-center loads. So if it's leaning more to the right, we can set our right airbag up a little bit more, or set the left one down, or whatever we may need. Even at night, we're going to be able to keep an eye on our air pressure, because there's going to have a built-in light in the gauge that's going to illuminate it, so at a quick glance we can see exactly what our airbags are set at. And deflating them is going to be just as easy. We can push down, and that'll let the air out. Our gauge is going to be able to go from 0 all the way up to 150 psi. Just keep in mind, you want to make sure that your airbags can handle that amount of pressure. Our gauge and switches are going to come as one unit. We'll have the single face gauge with dual dials and 2 switches. That way we can easily control each side. The left side is going to be the orange dial, and the right side is going to be the black needle. And the gauge and switches are both going to mount super easy anywhere you see fit on the dash, just using a couple of screws. So here's what our compressor and air tank look like in our kit. Now our compressor is going to be a heavy duty air compressor, and it is going to put out 150 psi. Again, double check your airbags, make sure they can handle that amount of pressure. Now what's really unique about this is that they're going to have these rubber bushings directly installed onto the compressor. So however we mount it, if we drill it to the frame or use a no-drill bracket like we did here, those bushings are going to take a lot of vibrations out. So we're not going to have to worry as much about the noise or any kind of rattling going on when we're going down the road. Now the tank itself is going to be a half-gallon tank. Now with it being a half-gallon tank, the flow rate based on this is going to be from 0 to 30 psi, it's going to take 7 seconds, and from 0 to 60 psi it'll take 18 seconds. So we can quickly adjust our air pressure to suit our needs. Our compressor is going to have a maximum amperage of 23 amps, and it's going to have a full 100% duty cycle. So we know it's going to have all the power we need to fill up our tank and take care of the pressure we need at our airbags. Our Firestone Air Command kit is going to work with all Firestone airbags. Just keep in mind that those are sold separately. Not only is our compressor kit going to be nice for our airbags, but it's also going to provide us a service valve where we can fill things up, as well as a hose. So we can take our hose, put it onto the fitting, we can lock it in place. Now we can go around, fill up the tires on our truck, or fill up anything else that needs air that's within a close range. So if you do a lot of frequent towing or hauling, our compressor kit is going to make it a lot nicer. We're not going to have to get out and inflate our airbags in the back of our hitch every time, which is going to make it a lot easier if our loads change or if the trailer changes. Not to mention the fact that if we get a low tire or someone else is around that needs some air, having that service valve is going to be a really nice option. So now that we've gone over some of the features of our compressor kit and seen what it looks like, let's show you how to get it installed. So we're going to begin our installation by setting up our compressor and the other components in our kit. You'll notice we're going to have these little red caps on our compressor. We're going to want to pull those out. We're going to have one here and then one on the back side of the compressor. We're going to want to grab our T-fitting. It'll have a push connector on one end, a female threaded end, and a male threaded end. We're going to thread the male threaded end into the brass fitting coming off the head of the compressor. Now we want to make sure we tighten this up so that the thread lock inside engages fully, but we don't want to crank on it to where it's going to cause any problems. So we can grab a 1/2-inch wrench and we'll just make sure that it's nice and snug and that thread lock is engaging. And you also want to make sure that the female threaded section is at least pointing away from the compressor, because we're going to need to thread something in there and you don't want to have to fight the limited space. Next, we're going to grab our pressure switch. It's going to have a green plastic cap on the end of it. We can pull that out. And we're going to thread that into the female section of our T-fitting. And again, you want to make sure that thread lock gets into the threads. The pressure switch itself, the way we're going to tighten it up, I'm going to use an adjustable wrench, but you can use either a 27mm wrench or an 1 1/16 inch wrench. And again, you don't want to go super tight. You just want to make sure that the thread lock gets in there so we won't have any leaks. Next, we're going to grab our air tank, and on each end we're going to have these plastic plugs, and it's going to be threaded inside. So we'll remove both the plugs, and we'll grab the 1/4 inch push fitting out of our kit, and again it's going to have a male threaded section, and we'll thread that into the end of the tank and tighten it up until that thread lock engages. Grab a 9/16 wrench and snug it up. We'll do that on both ends of our tank. Since we're using the no-drill brackets, we want to go ahead and mount our tank to the bracket itself. So if we flip our tank over, we can see that we're going to have 2 holes. They're going to be our mounting holes. So we'll grab one of our brackets. We're going to line up the studs with the holes in our tank. We'll just slide it in place. Then we can take the included flange nuts and we'll get them started by hand. Then we can come back with a 9/16 wrench and tighten them up. The bracket for our compressor is going to work a little bit differently. We're going to have this plate. You'll notice it's going to have several holes in it. That's because it's going to fit a lot of different compressors. But the holes on the end here line up with the same brackets that were on our air compressor tank. We'll line up with the studs. And again, we'll take those flange nuts. We'll thread them in place on all 4 corners. We'll come back with a 9/16 socket and snug all of them up. And we have a sturdy platform to mount our compressor directly up to. Now, since we're going to want our bracket to sit as flat against the frame as possible, we're going to put the flat side down and be mounting our compressor on this side. So we're going to take one of our machine screws and a flat washer, and coming from the bottom going up through the top, we'll pass it through the holes that are going to line up with our compressor. So if we hold it up, we can figure out which holes we need to use. Then we can pass through our hardware through each one of those. We can take our compressor now, and we'll slide our hardware through the bushings that are on there. Then we'll take another flat washer, slide it over the screw. Then we're going to loosely install a locking nut to secure everything down. And we'll do that for all 4 corners. So I'm going to lift my compressor up. I'm going to hold the screw on the back side with the screwdriver while I come back with a 10mm socket and snug up the nut. We'll make sure we do that for all 4 corners. Now, if you remember, we have one more threaded hole at the back of our compressor. We're going to want to find the barb fitting that's in our kit, and we'll thread that into the back side. You just want to make sure you get that nice and snug. Using a 9/16 ratcheting wrench, you can use a socket or the open end of the wrench, whichever is easiest for you. So now that we have the compressor mounted to the brackets, the way this is going to work is we're going to stand our compressor up so it's going to be flat against the frame. And then we'll take these U-bolts and we're going to go around the frame, passing them through the holes, and then we can put the nuts on and it'll squeeze against the frame and hold everything in place. And our tank's gonna work the same way. So we found that the emergency brake cable and everything else on the driver's side was really interfering with mounting everything. So we moved over to the passenger side, right by our muffler here. And we're gonna do the same thing, just passing those U-bolts around the frame. And this time we're gonna have a lot of room. We're not gonna have to worry about hitting anything, and we can slide them as needed. So we go ahead and put all 3 of them around the frame. Just kind of want to watch for any kind of connectors or anything on top of the frame. Make sure you do get all the way around them. And then we can move to the outside and hang our tank and compressor. So we'll slide the U-bolts through the brackets on our tank. And we'll take those locking nuts and put one on each end. We don't have to worry about the tank falling down. It may still move a little bit, and that's okay. But we don't have to worry about it falling off the frame. Now for clearance purposes, I'm going to move the tank as close as I can to this running board mount. That way I have more room for my compressor right behind it. And when you put your compressor up, you want to make sure you keep the wires out from behind the bracket. And just because this is a little bit heavier than the tank, I'm going to get one side started, make sure those nuts are in place, and then I'll work on getting the other U-bolt through the bracket. And whenever you mount your compressor, you just want to make sure you still have access to all your fittings, and you can route your electrical cables to that pressure switch, which is going to be on top. Then once we have everything positioned where we want it, we can go ahead and snug up our hardware. Again, this is a 9/16 socket. And with these U-bolts, you want to kind of alternate going back and forth. That way you get an even draw on that bracket. Next, we're going to focus on the barb fitting on our compressor. We're going to take the black tubing out of our kit. We're going to push it directly onto that barb fitting. You want to make sure you get a good connection. Then I always like to go up, that way it'll be out of the way. So we'll just start by going up over the tank. And for now, we'll just bring it back down so we can work with it. On the other end, we're going to grab the filter. It's also going to have a plastic barb fitting on it, so we'll press it directly onto that tubing. Make sure we get as much of that line in there as possible. So it's important that our filter is going to be lower than the compressor, and it's going to be in a nice dry spot. So I came forward from the compressor, and we're right by our DEF tank, right by the passenger door on the bottom of our truck. Now to make it easy for myself, I'm going to take the filter off just temporarily. I'm going to pass my line through that DEF tank guard here. And we'll pull the excess slack out. We'll reattach our filter. And then we can actually slide our filter inside the guard here. That way it'll keep the moisture out of it, and it'll be at one of the lowest spots on the truck. And then we can take some zip ties and zip tie our tubing out of the way so it's not hanging down. That tubing went from the fitting in our compressor. We passed it over our air tank. Then we took all that excess, made a big loop, and zip tied it to some existing wiring. Went over the cab mount, and we actually jumped right into the DEF tank cover right at the top, passing it down, again zip tying it at that anchor point and putting our filter inside. Now on our compressor, we're going to have 2 different wires, a red wire with a spade terminal on it and a black wire with a ring terminal. Our black wire is going to be our ground, so we're going to go directly into the frame with this. So we're going to pass it through this hole in the body mount. So we have this nice open area right here. Now we're going to want to take a self-tapping screw and go directly into the frame. But before we take our screw, I'm going to pre-drill the frame. That way it's a little bit easier to get in place. You just want to use a drill bit that's a little bit smaller than your self-tapping screw. Then we'll take our self-tapping screw, go through our ring terminal, and secure it down. You want to make sure it's tight enough that that ring terminal isn't going to move around on you. Now for our red wire, we're going to have this plastic cover that's on our pressure switch. We'll have 2 terminals on there. We're going to want to put our spade terminal on one of those, and it's not going to matter which one we put it on. I'm going to slide it on and make sure it gets on there and it's nice and secure. Now we can start making our airline connections. Now we're going to have to go from our tank to our compressor to start with. You're going to want to grab one of the bundles of line from your kit, and it's always a good idea to inspect the end of it. Make sure it's a clean, straight cut on there. And if not, you want to make sure you use a tubing cutter so you can have a clean, straight cut. And we're going to do this for every time we cut our airline. You can see how it's just a nice, clean, straight cut. But we'll take one end. We're going to go directly into our air tank. And you'll feel it kind of click, and it's going to bottom out. And then just because we don't want to get too close to our compressor, I'm going to go up and kind of curve it going up so it doesn't have an extreme curve. But we're going to be connecting it into the end of the fitting over here that's right next to our pressure switch. So we'll route it over our compressor. We'll estimate about how much line we're going to need. We'll trim it back, and then it's going to go directly into that fitting. And again, just kind of push it till it bottoms out. Give it a quick tug, make sure it's fully seated. Our airbag kit did come with manual inflation valves that we have mounted right by our hitch here. Now, if you want to keep these, you're going to need to put a T in line with each one of our airbags. Now that's what we're going to do, and we'll show you how to put those T's in place. But if you're not going to be keeping the manual inflation valves, you're going to need to remove all the airlines as well as the valves back here, and we'll be running new ones for the bags going to the compressor and the gauge itself. So here's one of the airlines that's going directly into our bag. We'll take our tubing cutter and we're going to cut our line. You want to make sure you try to get as much air out of the line as possible so we don't get a big burst when we cut that line. Then we'll take our T. We're going to reconnect both sides of our airline to it. Just make sure it bottoms out all the way and it locks in place. And we're going to do that for the other side airbag as well. So we're going to take our airline and we'll plug it directly into that T. We're going to do that for each side. Now once we have it plugged in, we're going to route both airlines up towards the front of our cab. Now it's a good idea to go ahead and mark your airline in some way so you know which one's the left, which one's the right, and we can keep track of everything. So we'll go ahead and route everything up and then we'll show you how we got it there. On the driver's side here, I started routing my wire towards the front and I went to the outside of the frame on top and I just followed it along the frame, zip tying it to the existing wire loom that's already there until I got up to where the cab is, where I had all my airlines meet. Now on the passenger side, I routed it again alongside the frame, keeping it away from the exhaust as much as possible, and zip tying it to the top of the frame along with this loom. Following it all the way, going over the compressor and over our air tank. And while we were here, we also went ahead and connected our other airline to the other push fitting that's in our tank. And we routed both the passenger line and the air tank line over this support bracket and through this cross member all the way to the other side where it met up with our airline from the left side airbag. Now if we look close to where our airlines are, just right behind the front tire, we're going to have our emergency brake cable going into the cab at the bottom of this grommet here. We're going to want to pop that grommet out so we can use that to also get our airlines through. Now if you can, I'm going to take a razor knife and we're just going to cut a slit coming from the center going out. I'm going to give us a little bit of tension relief off of the grommet. Then we can take a screwdriver and we're going to want to try to push this in to the cab so that we can take it out. And if you can't get the grommet fully out, you just want to make sure that that hole is going to be large enough so that we can fit all three airlines through there. If we move to the inside of the cab, that grommet's going to be in this general spot just right in front of our driver's seat. So if we come to the threshold here, we just kind of grab a piece of it and lift up. There's going to be some tabs holding it in place. And once we get over here, we're just going to pry away and we can pull this panel up, making it a lot easier to get underneath the carpet. We'll set this panel aside. We can lift up the carpet here, kind of just fold it out of the way for now. And we'll see our grommet's going to be right here. So we can either try to pull the entire thing out, or again, just make sure you have a large enough area that you can pass your airlines up through the grommet. So we'll reach underneath and we're going to pass all 3 airlines through. And once we get them up, we'll pull all the excess slack out and make sure they didn't get tangled up underneath. And with all 3 of our airlines up top, what I like to do is just take a little bit of electrical tape, kind of wrap them together so they stay together and it's a little more neat. We'll just do it upstream from that grommet a little bit. Get a nice little bundle and tape it together. So with our airline tubes ran, we're going to need to find a spot that we want to mount our gauges and switches. We're going to mount ours right to this compartment so it's an easy accessible spot, but it's not going to be in the way of our legs while we're driving. So since this is where we know we're going to mount it, we're going to need to get our airline tubes to right about this area here. So we can take our bundle and we're going to go underneath the carpet behind the pedals and then route it behind this pillar here so we can have them come out right here. So you want to try to stay underneath the carpet and out of the way of anything. So we'll just make a big loop. We're going to pass our airlines up. And again, just kind of tuck behind everything so they're nice and out of the way. Pull all the excess through and secure everything with a few zip ties. We're going to go ahead and pull this compartment out. That way it's a little bit easier to mount the gauge. So if we open it up, we're going to push in on the sides, which will allow it to drop down. And then these are just going to be press fit in place so we can just pull down and they'll slide right out. So we'll take our gauge and we're going to set it about where we want it to be on our panel. We'll take a marker. We're just going to make a mark on each side, and that'll give us a reference point of where we need to drill. Then we can grab a 3/32 drill bit and we're going to drill right into the plastic. Now we can take one of our machine screws and a flat washer. Coming from the back side, we're going to pass it through until it comes through the front side of our panel. And we'll do that for both holes. We'll take our gauge and we're going to slide the studs through the slots on the side. We'll take another flat washer and lock nut to secure everything down. And you're going to want to hold the screw on the back side with a Phillips screwdriver. And then we can come back with a 10mm socket and tighten it up. Now if we look on the back of our gauge with our switches, we're going to have 2 push fittings. Those are going to be the inlet. Then we'll have 2 barb fittings on each side. Those are going to be the outlet. So we want to find our left and right airlines that are going directly to the bags, and those are going to be going on our barb fittings. So we'll give ourselves a little bit of extra airline. Again, using a tubing cutter, we'll cut one of them. And this one I marked down further. That's going to be the left side. So keep in mind though, when you put your panel back, you want to make sure you're putting it on the left side. So if we flip it over, it's actually going to be this one over here. We'll just take our airline and we're going to push it directly onto that barb fitting, getting as much of that on there as possible. And we'll take our other side for the right side and we'll attach it over to the other barb fitting as well. Now we should have one more airline. That's going to be the one coming from the tank. Now we're going to go ahead and trim this, but we're going to cut it very far back here because we're going to need to install a T. That way we can have our main line coming in and then it'll split off going into each side. And we'll hold on to the excess line that we cut off, put our T in, And we can estimate about how much line we'll need. We'll double that. And then we can cut it in half so we have 2 equal pieces. And one airline go into one section of the T. And then you just want to make sure you plug it into both of those push fittings. It doesn't matter which one from the T goes into which push fitting. You just want to make sure that each one of them is plugged in and that all your connections are locked down. On the back of our gauge, we're going to have 2 wires. One's going to be our ground wire and one's going to be power for the light to illuminate the gauge. So we'll start out with our ground wire. We'll pull the insulation back off of the wire. We'll go ahead and strip back just a little bit. That way we make sure we have enough. Then we can take a butt connector. We're going to slide our wire in and we'll crimp it in place. Then you're going to want to grab the bundle of wire that's in your kit. Find one end. We'll strip it back. We'll put the other end inside the butt connector. Now we're going to need to find a good spot that we can attach this so we have a good ground. So we'll go and route our wire back the way our airline tubes came towards the firewall so we can find a spot to ground it at. With our wire ran over towards the firewall, we're going to have a stud right here we can use as our ground. So we'll estimate about how much wire we need, and then we can cut it, strip it back, and put our ring terminal in place. Grab a 10mm socket and we can pull that nut off, slide the ring terminal over. And if the stud is just a little too big for the ring terminal, what we can do is we can take a pair of cutters. We're going to cut our ring terminal into a C shape. That way it can go around the stud, and then we can put our nut back in place. For our power wire, again, we'll take off a little bit of that insulation, strip it back just a little bit. And we'll get another butt connector and crimp it in place. Then we'll take the excess wire that we have left over and we'll put it in the other side of the butt connector. Now we're going to route this along the same path as the airlines and where our ground went, except this wire is going to go back out the grommet where our airlines came into the truck. So we'll pull back our carpet and we'll pass our wire down through the grommet. You may have to move your airlines a little bit to get it through there because it is going to be a little bit of a tight fit. We'll pass it all the way down and get all that excess wire at the bottom of the truck. So when I dropped my wire down, I pulled back the loom and cut the tape away from the wiring harness, and I found the wire that's going to be for our running lights. Now it's going to be a brownish colored wire, and the way you're going to test this is you're going to take a test light or circuit tester and you're going to check the wire and make sure that you're not getting any power when the lights are off. Like right now we're not getting power to either side of our wire, but when we turn the lights on we'll have power to that wire. So we'll go ahead and cut it in half and we're going to strip back both ends. Then we can bring over our red wire. Good idea to give yourself a little bit of extra. We can cut that wire. And we'll combine the red wire and one end of our running light wire together. Then we can take a heat shrink butt connector. We'll slide both wires into one end and crimp it down. Make sure it crimped well. Then we can take the other end of our wire and crimp it into the other side of our butt connector. I'm going to use a heat gun to shrink down my connector. Now you just want to be careful if you are using an open flame like a torch or a lighter, not to burn the connector or any of the other wires. Now I'm just going to wrap this bundle back up with some electrical tape to help protect the wires, and then we can always go back and put the loom back on as well. Now we're going to have one more electrical connection we're going to need to make, and that's going to be at the compressor here on the other spade terminal. So we'll take our length of red wire, we're going to strip back the end of it, then we're going to take the spade terminal that's in our kit, we'll slide it over the end, and we'll crimp it in place. This is going to go directly onto the other side of the pressure switch. We'll just slide it on the terminal, Now the instructions are going to inform you and tell you to put this wire to an ignition source. Typically you can find an ignition source either in that wire loom that we were working with earlier, or how we're going to do it is we're going to find a fuse under the hood that only has power when the ignition is on. Because of how complicated some of the electronics in this truck are, we'd rather use a fuse tap than cut the wire itself. So we're going to run this along the same route we took our airlines towards the front, but we're going to stop close to the firewall. So we routed our wire taking the same path, except once we got up towards our airline tubes, we're not going into the passenger compartment, we're going to be going into the engine bay. So we can take our wire, we're going to go over this cab mount and follow the same path as the factory wires, and we're going to pull all that excess so it goes right over that mount. Now what we can do is we can actually take a piece of that airline tube that we have left over and push it up into the engine bay. That way we can pull our wire up to the top. We start routing the wire up just so we can reach it once we get underneath the hood. Then we'll take the free end of our wire and put it inside the airline tube, and then just take a little bit of electrical tape and secure it so we don't lose it when we start pulling it to the top of the engine. So our airline tube is right here, right by the back of the firewall. So we can just reach in, grab it, and we want to route it towards the driver's side, right there on the edge, because our fuse box is going to be right there. So pull our wire up until we have all the slack out of it. Then we can pull the airline tube off. Now for right now, I'm just going to wrap the wire around the support. That way it doesn't fall back down underneath the engine. But we can bring our attention to the fuse box, which is going to be right underneath that support on the driver's side. We'll have two locking tabs. Pull towards the front. We can lift up the lid, slide it forward, and then we'll have access to all of our fuses. We're going to want to go through and we're going to check each one of our fuses to see if it has power when the ignition is on. Currently the key is in the on position. So we have a 30 amp fuse that is getting power right now, so we'll go ahead and turn the ignition off and see if we have power or not. So with the key off, we'll go ahead and check that same fuse. So our truck is going to have a little bit of a time delay. It's still going to be receiving power for a few seconds after the ignition's off, but that 30 amp fuse here is going to be a good power source for our compressor. And that fuse is going to be fuse number 51. So we'll go get a pair of needle nose pliers. We're going to pull the fuse out, and you'll notice that this is going to be a micro fuse. It is going to be a lot smaller than the standard fuse and even smaller than some of the mini fuses that are out there. We're going to be using a micro fuse tap so that we can get power from this fuse. Now that we've identified the fuse, we need to find out which side is the hot side of the fuse so that when we use our tap, we're not pulling power from the accessory itself. So you want to take your tester and you're going to put it into the terminal. So the side closest to the tailgate is going to be our hot side. And we won't have any power on the other side because the fuse isn't there completing the circuit. So here's what our fuse tap is going to look like. We're going to have a very small slot. That's where the blade of the fuse is going to go through. And that top piece is going to stick out so we can tap into it. So let's take our fuse, we'll slide the blade into that little slot. It may take a little bit of pressure to get it on there. It's going to be a tight fit. You may need a pair of pliers to slide it on. So once you get your fuse tap on, this is what it should look like. Now again, you remember the fuse tap needs to go to the hot side of the fuse. So we'll put our fuse back in the slot, making sure that the tap is going towards the back of the truck. Just make sure that it's all the way seated in there. Now that we have our fuse tap in place, we can take our wire. It's always a good idea to leave yourself a little bit of excess, so I don't think we're going to trim any off of here, but we'll strip back the end of our wire. Then we're going to grab a spade terminal, slide it over the wire and crimp it down. Then we can take it And I'm going to pass it through the fuse panel, and I'm going to plug it directly into the fuse tap. Slide the cover back into the slots on the back side. And we'll see if we have to trim anything or if we can get it around the wire. It looks like the cover is going to go back into place without having to squish the wire too much, so we should be okay. Now we found that the wire underneath the truck was not providing a full 12 volts, so that it wasn't lighting up our gauge. So what we did was we ran that wire the same path we did for our compressor up to the fuse box, and we're going to use one of the tail light fuses to power our light. So if we can grab a pair of needle nose pliers. It's going to be fuse 28 and 29. One's going to be for the left and one's going to be for the right. We can use either one. We'll get another one of our fuse taps, slide it over our fuse, and we'll get it in place just like the other one. Make sure the fuse tap goes all the way on there. I'm going to replace the fuse again with the hot side with the fuse tap on it. Then we can trim our wire and crimp a new spade terminal on. Before we tidy up all our wires and put all of our panels back, it's a good idea to make sure that everything's working. So we can turn our headlights, and you can see that there's a small glow around the gauge. And we'll turn our ignition on. We can hear the compressor kicking on. And we can see that it's filling up both side airbags. So now with everything working and we know it's all hooked up properly, we can put all of our panels, carpet, and everything back in place, and we can put a few zip ties to secure everything down where we see needed. I'm going to take all the excess wire and lines. We're going to push them back behind the dash here so we can hopefully hide as much as we can. Our kit's going to come with another inflation valve. Now this is going to be for a service line coming from our air tank so that we can fill up either our tires or another vehicle. So we're going to find a spot to mount this, and the best spot's going to be back here on the bumper close to our license plate light. On the passenger side we'll have our license plate light and then the cover for access to our spare tire. We're going to want to come down and maybe back towards the front of the truck a little bit, towards the inside of the bumper, but we're going to be drilling from the inside, so we're going to come underneath the bumper and drill a hole. We just want to go through the plastic. So I'm going to be using a 5/16 drill bit, and we're going through the side just behind and below our license plate light. We can take our inflation valve, we're going to slide a flat washer over it, and coming from the inside we'll pass it through, making sure it goes all the way through the hole. We'll place another flat washer over the outside, and then finally we'll put the nut to hold it in place. We can take a 1/2 inch wrench on the nut on the outside while we're holding the fitting on the inside and tighten it up. Now you don't need to go super tight on this, you just want to make sure that it's snug enough and that nut's not going to back off. Now we're going to come to the airline that's coming out of our air tank going up toward our gauge. Now we're going to want to cut this and install a T, that way the airline will still go to our gauge, but then we can take that other section and run it back toward our valve. Now keep in mind, before you cut this, if you did run your compressor by turning the ignition on, there is going to be air inside the line, so when you cut it, a lot of air is going to escape all at once. Place in both sides of our line, make sure they lock in. We can grab the rest of our airline tube, put it into our T, and we're going to route this back to the inflation valve and zip tie it as needed. Just like all our other fittings, and press it in, make sure it locks into place. That'll finish up your look at the Firestone Air Command 2 compressor and air tank, part number F2168 on our 2018 Chevrolet Silverado 2500.